7.
Hello and welcome to a special half hour with Amitav Ghosh, whose 10th book and the first part of his ambitious, sprawling trilogy, Sea of Poppies, is just out. Extraordinary work. 500 pages, probably the longest book you've ever written.
It's about the same size as The Glass Palace, so not quite the longest, but about the longest.
But a far bigger canvas, enormous range of characters, and the most ambitious, or one of the most ambitious forays into 19th century India. Two major themes that you deal with are, of course, the opium trade and the flight of hundreds and thousands of poor Indians forced to go abroad as indentured labor. What took you into this part of early, mid-19th century history?
Well, it's been an interest of mine for a long time because, as you know, I've always been interested in migration and people leaving India and so on. But I really became interested in the early years of that migration, especially the movement to Mauritius, which started in the 1830s. And of course, you know, all the migrants came from the major poppy growing regions.
Which is Uttar Pradesh and Bihar.
It's Bihar. And it's the Bhojpuri-speaking region, really. And the migrants were mainly Bhojpuri-speaking, as you know. Those things came together, really. It wasn't that I started looking for opium or anything, but it became inescapable because, you know, if you're talking about India's overseas trade at that time, opium was absolutely the most important commodity that was leaving India.
It was really the key. It enriched the colonial British, but it also impoverished very large numbers of Indians in eastern UP and Bihar. The opium factories that you so in such detail describe at Ghazipur still exist along the Ganges plain.
Absolutely still exists and continues to produce a very large amount of opium. It's probably the world's single biggest producer right now, but completely legitimately, because let's not forget, you know, that opium is a very important and useful drug. I mean, you know, morphia, morphine, codeine, all these things are very important drugs. But yes, and that description of the opium factory, it came from a book written by an English superintendent of that factory, and he wrote that book as a tourist guide. He wanted to get English tourists to visit this opium factory in Ghazipur.
Terrifying is the spectacle of what opium production on a large scale, though it filled the coffers of the British and then finally led to the great trade to China and indeed the opium wars, but what it did to the economic landscape of that region. It really put hundreds and thousands of people into a terrible trap of poverty.
There haven't actually been any kind of real studies of what it did to the society.
What actually happened?
First, we see that there's an incredible increase of opium production in that area, literally in like 10, 20 years, you know, doubling or tripling, 10 times it increases, you know, in the space of a few decades. So clearly there's something very, very large going on here.
Which is contiguous with the migration.
Which is contiguous with the migration. And don't forget that then it's those same areas which become the epicenter of the Great Mutiny. And there must clearly be some sorts of relationships between these disparate facts.
Of economic entrapment, social unrest, leading migrants in flocks, literally being herded into the entrepot of Calcutta.
That's right, that's right. One thing about the indenture is that at least it allowed people some form of escape, you know, from a situation of what must have become by that time
a blighted existence.
A completely blighted existence, yes.
Right. What is very interesting, though, is this huge range of characters that you develop from an upper caste widow who's virtually pulled at the last minute from her husband's funeral pyre, and then, of course, low caste Dalits. So clearly, the migration and the relationships that developed among the potential migrants really cut across caste lines.
Yes, this is one of the most interesting things about migration, you know. I mean, that when you're actually on that ship, I mean, people are forced together on that ship. They're all crossing the Kalapani. In some sense, all of them, because they're crossing the Kalapani, become outcasts. But then they create their own communities, They create their own world. They become their own little, sanskar,
Right. So the jahaz, as you say, creates a kind of bhai-bandi, a brotherhood and a sisterhood that really is completely egalitarian in a sense, because here is this floating island on an ocean.
So it should be. And in fact, if you speak to Girmitiyas, as they're called, and their children, they'll always tell you that, they'll tell you about someone you meet, his father and mine were Jahaz Bhais. So it creates a kind of, they think of themselves as cousins, or like you might think of yourself being from the same village or something. And it is true that I think that it certainly led to a great dilution of caste, but it didn't do away with caste, because if you go to Mauritius today, caste is very important. I mean, it's important in their politics, it's important in many parts of their lives.
Two other things that excited me very much about the Sea of Poppies. One is your extraordinary and very wide-ranging and detailed portrait of 19th century Calcutta. The Nabobs, we have an indebted Raja from Rajabari, down to the great ship chandlers, the ship owners, the great overnight fortunes that the Nabobs made out of the opium trade and exports.
Yes, well, not just opium. I mean, it was also shipping out prisoners. That was another great trade. I mean, Calcutta was really the entrepot for shipping out, as they used to say in those days, drugs and thugs. And they went off across the Indian Ocean.